So now I'm going to introduce two speakers. Abby Helsinger joined the Scripps Gerontology Center at Miami University as a senior research associate in February 2020 after a 15-year career in preventative health and chronic disease prevention at local YMCA organizations in Ohio and YMCA of the United States in Chicago. Samuel Van Vleet joined Miami University as a graduate student in August of 2019. And after the completion of his bachelor's degree in psychology and applied gerontology from the University of North Texas. Both Abby and Samuel work closely with Dr. Phyllis Cummins at the Scripps Gerontology Center as well. So welcome, Abby and Samuel.
Okay, perfect. Hi, everyone. My name, as she said, is Samuel Van Vleet. Graduate researcher here at Miami University in Ohio. And today I would like to be discussing the strategies of engaging marginalized adults in education and training programs. Okay, perfect. You can go to the next slide, please. Perfect. Awesome. Our project utilized virtual interviews with 61 experts in adult education and training from 10 different countries. There are many challenges of engaging and retraining racial and ethnic minority older adults. We see that the opportunities for adult education training are often pursued by higher income and higher skilled adults. And the concern here is that the lack of training opportunities puts marginalized groups at a larger disadvantage than they previously were at. And all of these barriers have now been increased due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Next slide. So if you're looking here at this graph, you look to the right side of the graph, we see that the Black population has been impacted the greatest from COVID-19 related to unemployment. Specifically, the most impacted group was Black American populations with less than a high school diploma. Next slide. And as we look at this graph, we see that Hispanic and Black adults were far more likely to cancel or change their education plans due to COVID-19. Next slide. So what does this all mean? Well, we're looking at the different barriers in which people have participation in difficulties retraining in education programs. We see that these are manifested in categories such as situational barriers, institutional barriers, and dispositional barriers. Situational barriers are often, but not limited to, cost of education, lack of time, issues with childcare, difficulties with transportation, and general support from family and friends. Next slide. This quote is from an Australian informant related to formal education for adults aged 40 to 45, and it reads, those people don't have the ability to change direction. Because if you want to do formal educational training in Australia, if you want to do university education, it's going to cost you, and it means withdrawing from the workforce. As we see from this quote, the pursuit of formal education can be a large setback for the workforce population. Potential strategies for these financial barriers might be the shaping of expansion of Pell Grants and other financial opportunities for subpopulation in response to the recognition of long-time structures, policies, and practices that have led to inequitable outcomes for learners. Other countries, for instance, offer assistance for attaining adult education. In Norway, employers often receive subsidies from the government for providing training in the workplace. In Italy, adult learning programs are often free and normally no charge for students. Next slide. Another barrier for adult education are institutional barriers. Adult students often struggle with these barriers, barriers like lack of time, lack of information needed to complete an education program, lack of access to computer and internet, difficulties in enrollment processes, and inconvenient and inflexible course scheduling. Next slide. The quote in bold is referring to technological barriers for adult education. It reads, older adults' access to technology and skills is actually quite limited. And we'll show more information on the next slide regarding these difficulties in access to technology and what they mean. Next slide. So that's the slide. This graph shows the percentage of adults with difficulties attaining reliable internet and computer access. It is clear to see that adults from marginalized communities are more likely to have lack of access to the needed education and training materials. Some potential strategies for this might be to combat these barriers with offering additional support to students who have a lack of familiarity with online learning and computers in general. Also, ensuring that students have access to internet at home is crucial and a fundamental aspect to online learning. This could mean that internet providers may offer no or low cost internet access to low income households. In addition to that, we also see that finally we could be working to ensure that students have access to computer and equipment, technological equipment at home. This comes in the form maybe of grants and funding sources that might be available to provide low income households with computer and the technology needed to continue their education and training. Now I'll turn it over to Abby.
Thanks, Samuel. I don't know if my video will start and go on to the next slide. So we'll talk next about dispositional barriers, and that's going to be our final category, and we'll really spend the most time here because our informants really highlighted dispositional barriers. Dispositional barriers include lack of confidence in their ability, concern about being too old, being tired of school, having a lack of enjoyment in studying. And can we have this slide? And go ahead to the next slide. Thank you. So as you can see, this quote is really regarding feelings of failure, and it reads, "Second chance learners, so those learners who were returning to study after having a checkered history of learning in school, they had very negative perceptions of themselves as learners, that they were stupid, that they couldn't learn, they'd never been a good learner, they didn't have the skill or capabilities to learn," which is terrible to think that these people had held these internal dialogues about their capacity to learn for so long. On the next slide, our quote regarding concerns about being too old reads, "There are very few programs for people above the age of 45. On the next slide, concerning lack of motivation and confidence, we see they have that opportunity, but you have the problem we mentioned before, that it's not always easy to motivate other people to start schooling again. So that is the problem. And finally, on the next slide, we see the challenge with traditional approaches. The quote is, "Herein lies the fundamental problem with educational training. It puts out curriculum that says, here's what you have to learn. Here's what you have to know. It takes no account of what people already know. A lot of people have had really rich lives. They can do almost anything. They can't necessarily sit in a room and be bored by people using pedagogies and content and technologies which are alien to them. It's the worst form. It's the worst form of abuse that you can get, is to put people through that." So the strategies to overcome dispositional barriers include offering programs and courses with academic and non-academic support available beyond the hours of the traditional day, because our adult learners typically have other competing priorities during the traditional day, and operating in ways that attract and retain their life and work experiences via adult-friendly strategies, such as offering prior learning assessments and providing flexible course offerings. One of our key informants from Australia quoted what they would call micro-credentialing courses, where they've built workshops on community development that the sector can add, and then they get an accreditation toward another qualification. So there's that sort of micro-credentialing through professional development, which I think is probably really groundbreaking in that sector. On the next slide, as we wrap up, we wanted to share this figure showing responses to a question posed to Americans ages 18 to 64. If you were to enroll in education or training in the next 6 months, what would be your goal? As you can see, 63% of American adults considering enrolling prefer non-degree programs. So those are certificates or certifications, licenses, courses to get some skills they need for work, or courses for personal interest. And this is consistent with our findings in our other research that investigated students ages 40 and older enrolled in Ohio's community colleges. The importance of our study and findings is really highlighted on the next slide. As you can see, when looking at attainment of associate's degree or higher by race and ethnicity in the US, the disparity among Blacks, American Indians, and Hispanics is really clear. Fewer than half of Americans who identify in these groups have degrees compared to their white or Asian and Pacific Islander counterparts. In summary, on the next slide, participants in adult education and training, or participating in adult education and training is critical to have skills demanded by employers. Unfortunately, lack of training opportunities for older adults may place them at a disadvantage. And as we saw, COVID-19 has disproportionately impacted racial and ethnic minority groups. Recruitment efforts tailored to support underserved, minority, middle-aged, and older adult workers are needed, and administrators should operate from an equity and inclusion lens, as individual experiences are not monolithic. Finally, as we saw 2 slides ago, to retain adult learners, multiple learning forms are necessary, including formal, non-formal, and informal learning. On the next slide, we just want to share that our references are available upon request, and we would like to recognize the research here was supported by the Institute of Education Sciences, U.S. Department of Education. Thank you.